Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new Pory Revenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first one is titled, A Poopy Pollock. For context, I have lived in my neighborhood going on 14 years now. When we first moved in, the place was a complete and utter dump. Original windows, 50 years old at the time. Old roof. Very dated on the inside. Most of the lawn was mud. Over the years, we have turned it around to one of the nicest homes in the entire neighborhood. The yard is now nearly immaculate. My folks always instilled in me to take pride in where I live. So on a night in the not-too-distant past, I am laid back in my easy chair, which is right next to the picture window in the living room. It is around midnight and I am thinking I am going to get up, go outside, and have a cigarette before bed. Before I can stand, I see brake lights in my peripherals. I begin to stand and then I hear screeching of tires. As I am popping out the front door, an old early 80s white Chevy shitbox truck pulls out of my driveway and starts tearing down the street, leaving mud tracks and a trail of debris. He abruptly stops about 6 houses down. Jumps out, slams the truck door, makes a beeline to the front door, and goes in, slamming the door behind him. I then notice the debris and mud tracks out in the road. I look over to the driveway and apparently in turning around he had went off the side of the driveway with his wheels. He had spun tires in the yard, leaving a trench about 5 feet long and a foot deep. I was absolutely livid. After a couple of deep breaths and a moment to gather myself, I decided that going down there to confront him would not end well. I was shaking mad and the damage was not so severe that I couldn't fix it. It was just not worth ending up in a fight or going to jail over it. So I came back inside and stewed. And stewed some more. Revenge of some sort had to be dealt. This a-hole had knowingly trashed my lawn and was such a common sob that he didn't even acknowledge it or apologize. Then I had my Eureka moment. Earlier in the day I had mowed the lawn. Before I mowed the backyard, I had to poop scoop it. This is my weekly ritual as I have 2 big fatty spaniels that both shit like a grown man. When I finished, I had a plastic grocery bag that was 3/4 of the way full which I had put in the trash bin. I grabbed a pair of rubber gloves from the bathroom and went outside and retrieved the fermenting bag of feces. I then made my way down the street to take care of business. It was now around an hour after the incident occurred. I was fully prepared to be caught in the act and a fight ensuing. I started putting on the rubber gloves as I approached. All the lights in the house were out. I was golden. I approached the driver's side door, which was directly under the street lamp. I looked in the bag and selected the juiciest, fattest turd sitting on top, and proceeded to smoosh it under the door handle. I reached in the bag again and grabbed a handful of foulness, and smooshed some more all over the mirror. I kind of started gagging at this point. I then proceeded to circle the truck, smearing, swirling, and slinging shit every which way but loose. As I had come full circle around the truck, the bag was getting low, so I proceeded to turn it inside out and wipe the remainder all over the windshield. I tossed the bag in the bed of the truck and then pulled off the gloves and tossed them in as well. I stepped back and admired my work. I only wish there had been more light for a picture. You literally could not tell the truck had been a white truck. It looked like a Poopy Pollock. A cornucopia of browns, orange, and mustard colors. A total masterpiece. Thoroughly pleased with my handiwork, I walked back to the house where I proceeded to shower and go to bed. I slept like a baby. Little did I know, the best was yet to come. The alarm went off at 8 a.m. I got up and started with my morning routine, not really giving the evening before a second thought. By 8:30, I went out to the front porch for my first cigarette of the day. I glanced down the street and saw the Poopy Pollock in all its glory, glimmering in the morning sun. I came back inside and sat in my easy chair to start working on my books for my business. Around 10 minutes until 9, I hear a guttural, ululent cry from the street. It honestly startled me. I hopped up and went to the door. As I stepped out onto the porch, I see that dickhead has discovered my masterpiece. He was flat out coming unglued. screaming. A lawn chair was thrown. His wife, girlfriend came out about that time, and when she saw what happened she started losing her crap. I proceeded to have a seat and enjoy the show. He hooked up his hose and proceeded to try and spray it off. She went back in the house and grabbed a mop of all things. She starts to try to wipe the shit off with a mop. Halfway through they start bickering. Then the shouting started back. Dickhead didn't have time for this. He was going to be late for work. He walked back inside but then came right back out heading for the truck. When he went to open the door to get in, he stopped for just a split second. He then went into a psychotic tantrum. Apparently he had failed to spray the handle off well enough, and ended up with a hand full of dog shit. At that point, I had to go inside as I could not contain myself. I hope I ruined his day. I know he sure made mine. The next one is titled, But What About the Inheritance? So this is a long old story involving my mum's aunt, all circulating since my mum's mum, my grandma, passed away. Note to this story I will refer to them as my aunt and uncle as it's the only names I've known them as, and this is an important note on why money ruins families. So background on my grandma. My grandma was the result of her parents having sex before marriage when it was not acceptable, which forced my great-grandparents to get married. Growing up there was a lot of resentment to my grandma and a large amount of abuse which did carry over to my grandma's brother, who was the golden child and I know as uncle. My grandma was pretty much told as soon as she was old enough she needed to get married so she'd no longer be their problem. Soon as my grandma turned 18 she got married into her own abusive marriage where instead of beatings he was a drunk who took all her money where her parents didn't care. Soon as my grandma left him she was left with nothing and had to go home to her parents' beatings instead. During this time in her life her own parents make it aware that once she was married she was her husband's problem and had changed their wills so the only person getting any money should they die would be uncle. My grandma is upset but accepts it anyway. Take 10 years later my grandma is remarried to my grandfather who treats her right but they struggle to get pregnant whilst her brother is married to his wife who is gloating that each time my grandparents come home after having a stillborn she has a perfectly healthy baby with each nursery for said child paid for by both grandparents. Just after the last gloat my grandma gives birth to my mum and both uncle and aunt worry about the inheritance after great-grandfather health takes a swan dive. Great-grandfather passes away and apart from a cheap pocket watch my grandma gets, she's left out of the will or any money given whilst uncle is literally gloating about how he can now afford his dream house. My grandma cuts a large amount of contact out through the amount of hurt they are causing. Fast forward now 15 years and my great-grandmother health is in real decline and uncle and aunt are talking about divorce as they had spent the money great-grandfather had left them and her own parents' money. My grandparents were freaking out at this point about her declining health and making sure she's not in pain whilst aunt openly says she hopes she does pass away as she needs cash. Yup. Classy people. Anyway great-grandmother before she passes away tells my grandmother that she hadn't wished to change her will to leave her out but had been forced to and handed her a wad of money telling her that whilst she wishes my grandmother had a better mother she had been the biggest mistake in her life. My grandma got her final happy moment with her mother but also a kick in the balls. My aunt and uncle hadn't been there at all so when they finally show up they are taking claim to items and saying nothing must leave the house until the will is sorted. Here comes part of the title. My grandma is the only one to try and sort out some sort of funeral for her and hoped the will would allow her some cash to bury her but as you've guessed it already aunt and uncle make it clear they are in charge of the will and anything to be passed around. They take charge of the funeral pretty much shoving my grandmother out and to add insult to injury shortly after the service they inform my grandma that she had been left nothing in the will and how great-gran hadn't bothered to include her for anything at all. Just a general note here, my mum during the service had gone to my great-grandma's house and had broken in to take a couple of items she knew my grandma wanted which was 2 photo albums, a few small rings and 2 small statues so my grandma actually gained some items from it all. My grandma did try to see if she could fight them to get anything but pretty much gave up and just cut complete contact with them especially after they refused to attend her own husband's funeral. So fast forward to a giant time skip to 2009 and I'm 10 going on 11 with no idea really who aunt and uncle apart from they send us a Christmas card once a year and occasional birthday card, but my grandmother's health is really deteriorating. My grandma pretty much knew her time was up and had spoken more openly on her upbringing, her family life and who uncle and aunt were. Turns out uncle had tried to reconnect when aunt left him once again over money problems, but since himself and aunt had reconciled, my grandma left him to his own death sentence, but uncle knew my grandma's health had really gone downhill once again. Anyway, my grandma happens to suffer a stroke at 78 and along with having diabetes and being pretty much blind, my grandma knows her time was coming to an end quicker than we all wanted to accept. She made my parents aware that under no circumstances we are to accept aunt and uncle into our lives, as aunt had been trying to call her more often under the impressions wanting to ensure my grandma had a will. Shortly after my grandma returns from rest care, my uncle visits her and attempts to pressure her into changing her will to ensure he is made in charge, as in his opinion, Mum will not cope with the pressures of planning your funeral and sorting out the house sale. My grandma had apparently agreed and was only stopped from doing so when she asked my dad to take her to an appointment to change the will. She told my dad her master plan and my dad takes her to the appointment. Fast forward to the end of August and my grandma's health rapidly declines in 24 hours to the point she was happy and healthy to being in the back of an ambulance. She is rushed to hospital and manages to survive another 24 hours before she passes away. My mum had informed uncle and aunt of my grandmother's condition, but they refused to visit at all. And this sends my mum into meltdown that she was alone in the world with 2 young children having to cope with planning a funeral. 3 days later is actually the first time I meet aunt and uncle in the flesh. They wanted to visit to discuss my grandma with my mum. Now this is a little blurry to me, however I do remember my uncle being sad about her passing away, and he did play with mine and my sister's Lego blocks with me and my sister, whilst aunt did question into why grandma had died so soon and also if we knew if there was any cash left to them. My mum, whilst upset, answered as many questions as she could before forcing them out as they were upsetting her further. So my grandma's funeral had to be set so it would either be held on my birthday or my aunt's son's birthday, which are 2 days apart. My parents had to choose aunt's son's birthday as they didn't really want it to be on their oldest daughter's birthday. This set a bad mood for the day as they tried to inform aunt and uncle of this news but had been ignored completely. The service was held and before it could even start my aunt is pressuring my parent to allow myself and my sister to sit with her side of the family. My parents kept us to their side of the family and start ignoring them. After the service is when this finally blows up. We had a small get-together afterwards where people came around to celebrate my grandma's life. A lot of her friends made big deals out of me and my sister by giving us a memory box of possessions they had that reminded them of my grandma. This had just been given to us when aunt starts boasting that uncle has the power of the will and they plan to take a certain amount for all the stress it caused on them. Jokes on them though. My dad asks them in which copy of the will was this the case, to which they reply the last copy she ever made. See if you remember from further back up, my grandma had changed her will with my dad being there, and this is where my dad slams down the power moves. The changes had been to give my mum and dad full control, a small amount to be set aside for me and my sister, and the grand total of 10p to be given to aunt and uncle. Oh, and if they contested the will, they got nothing. Nothing at all. As you can imagine, being told that they blew their lids, swearing and upsetting the kids in the room, and I remember being shuffled upstairs as my mum and dad kicked her out. Anyway, aunt being a douche, she contests the will and loses the grand total of 10p left to her and my uncle. My mum by then had sold off a lot of possession she didn't want to keep, and the house sale had been pretty much finalized by the time my uncle came begging for items to remember my grandma with, or to be given a small amount of money that was rightfully his, as surely his sister wanted to leave him something in the will. My mum laughed him out of her house, and that was the last time we actually saw either one of them. Why do I write this now though? Well, turns out in 9 years of being little to no contact, my uncle had died during the summer for us to only find out at Christmas via a Christmas card. Don't worry though, he was surrounded by loved ones as aunt so gracefully put it, but neither of them had much money left. For his funeral his children had to beg, borrow and steal the cash to afford his funeral, and in the Christmas card they asked if we could give him some money. My mum couldn't say goodbye to her uncle but did get to make a lovely bonfire instead using the card. The moral of this story is you may not get to choose your family, you do however get to choose who you call family. The last one is titled, Don't Let Your Enemy Be a Friend of Your Friends. So, I was flicking though Facebook, when I remembered something that I did to someone in secondary school. Details are a little hazy, but here goes. Back in school, I was several things. Awkward and weird in the extreme. Bit of a runt. Physically weak. Now, I had the fortune to go to one of the grammar schools in the UK, so for the most part, nothing happened. But one person who I do remember sticks out. I'll call him R. Short for a hole. Quite possibly the meanest bully I ever had. He always was trying something against me, and as a result, I spent a lot of time in the library, or with teachers. After all, I was sick of him constantly trying to trip me, or try to steal my things, or make fun of me, or most annoyingly of all, trying to copy my work. I took great pride in my success. I tried to not let it show. Haha, I look back, surprised at how dumb that was, but every once in a while, I would eventually break down. This persisted for the first 2 years. He always acted alone, perhaps cause he was trying to not look like an a-hole in front of everyone else. Anyhow, after those 2 years, R decided to shove me in a locker. Now, I'm claustrophobic, and he knew that. And when I was trying to frantically resist, he left me with a broken nose. I was locked inside, and was only let out when a teacher heard my pathetic sobs and pleas for help. He was suspended for a week. I spent some time in the medical room, and a week later it was all resolved. Except for the resentment I had. Not cool. The teachers were off the ball and doing nothing to protect me. I wanted this guy to suffer. I eventually got my chance. In mathematics, I was one of the best in the class. One of his friends was sorely struggling. Now, I wasn't the most socially adept person, but I knew my maths. When he ended up sitting next to me, I helped him out. Gave him pointers. His grades began to improve. He started helping me out with things like art. I didn't really improve much, but we forged an unlikely friendship. Anyhow, the compound effect of this was twofold. Not only had I gained some protection from R, but I had also entered his extended group of friends. And this friend I had made started dragging me along to hang out with them during break periods. Within 6 months, I was friends with all of AH's friends. I always acted friendly around R, never brought up anything at all. AH's friends were nice guys. Treated me real good. I eventually suggested setting up study groups in the library. Offered to arrange them. I asked about when everyone was available, and I always had things to do when I was available. How inconvenient. As such, although he was invited, I made sure he wasn't there. Suffice to say, due to us studying together once a week, our grades in our weaker subjects started to individually improve. As for R, he hadn't put much work into his own success. Without his friends to mooch from, his grades started tanking. Suddenly, he was being real nice to me. Trying to apologize to me in private so he wouldn't lose face in front of his friends. I told him my answer simply. This is the only exact phrase that I remember. You want to apologize? You apologize to me in front of your friends. This was now 8 months after the locker incident. He told me he would apologize. Okay, cool. I arranged the study group. This time, he could make it, and he gave his apology to me, in front of his friends. I asked if he was doing this just for grades. After all, his friends knew that his grades were tanking, and ours were on the rise. Cue my friends flipping out, asking him very pointed questions about what had happened. In that moment, I'd cut off R from his friends, and taken them as my own. His former friends were quick to ostracize him. I breezed through the rest of grammar school. We went our separate ways at college, took different subjects, and the group disbanded. Why was I reminded? Despite not talking to any of these guys in almost a decade, I found R on Facebook, and it asked if I knew him. I had a quick look on his profile. very few friends, and working a deadbeat job at 26 as a cashier. And no one from my old study group was a friend of his. Thanks for listening.